Her reading today comes from Lisa Ward and is entitled "A Covenant Invites Relationship." A covenant is not a definition of a relationship. It is the framework for our relating. A covenant leaves room for change and chance. It is humble toward evolution. It claims, "I will abide with you in this common endeavor, be present as best as I can in our becoming." This calls for a level of trust, courage, and sacrifice that needs to be nurtured, renewed, and affirmed on a regular basis. A creed creates a static truth, something that does not incorporate new insights and realities. A covenant is a dance of co-creation, keeping in step with one another in the flow of our lives. A creed seeks uniformity and a unison voice. A covenant seeks harmony and a shared voice. Sometimes we may arrive at a unison, but it is not required. A creed gives authority to the statement. A covenant gives authority to shared intention. A creed creates an us and them. A covenant invites relationship. A creed is a prescription that must be relied on. A covenant relies on the treasures of shared truth. There are moments in all of our lives where we are called on the carpet, where we receive a firm talking to about something we said or did that, for whatever reason, caused harm. Sometimes those conversations begin with, "I need to talk to you about something," or, "Charlotte, the principal would like to see you." In our faith communities, it can often include the phrase, "That was out of covenant." I'm sure that, like me, when these moments occur, you too get that sinking feeling in your gut, knowing you've hurt or disappointed someone you cared about. It can trigger in us a sense of shame or humiliation or defensiveness, because each of us is human, and thus each of us will experience this at least once in our lifetimes. We sort of understand and build in our brains. We train them to receive these words with a sense of foreboding, believing that nothing good can come out of what will be said next. But I found that that is rarely the case, particularly when it comes to covenant. On the other side of a conversation about covenant lies an invitation to deeper relationship with yourself, with others, and with our faith. It can be helpful to retrain your brain to interpret these moments as a calling in rather than a calling out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What is a covenant? For those of us who come from a Christian or Jewish background, we may only be accustomed to hearing this word used in a particular religious setting or context. However, the word itself is Latin for "come together" and means a solemn agreement or promise from the heart regarding a course of action between parties. So really, you can have a covenant between your friends in a treehouse, possibly, your partners, or anyone you'd like, really, and it needn't have anything to do with religion. When it is used in a religious context, it's often depicted as a legal contract of sorts between humanity and God. There are actually 5, some scholars say 6, covenants within the Torah alone: the Abrahamic, Mosaic, priestly, Davidic, and perhaps the most well-known, the Noahic covenant. Noahic being, of course, Noah, whose covenant with God after the flood came in the form of a rainbow. In the New Testament, we find the aptly named New Covenant, which is the covenant Jesus established at the Last Supper when, according to Luke, he said, "This cup is poured out for you in the new covenant in my blood." It is the new covenant in my blood. With the new covenant, the sins of the first covenants are forgiven and eternal salvation is offered with Christ's sacrifice as the Redeemer. But unlike the Mosaic covenant that was written as the Ten Commandments on a rock and was conditional upon the Israelites following the law, the new covenant is said to be written on the hearts of believers and is unilateral, meaning that God bound only herself to hold the covenant together, making the offer unconditional. You can see that a covenant, while often interpreted to mean a contract between two parties, goes much deeper than a pinky promise, which, by the way, I came up with that title before I actually knew the history of a pinky promise. It's pretty serious, y'all. Therefore, a covenant is far more spiritually important than a signature on a page. Paper can be torn in two. It can be made invalid by a judge, but not a covenant. To be fair, the way I'm speaking of it calls to mind the unbreakable vow from Harry Potter, with the wands and the binding, a bond so sacred that to break it means to die. I want to recognize that at this point in the sermon, you've probably remembered the part about Unitarian Universalism being a covenantal religion, and with the words I've just said, flood, blood, wand, and die, floating around in your head, you're likely calculating the steps from your seat to the exit door right now, but relax. While our use of the term covenant certainly comes out of our historical and continued connection to Judeo-Christianity, the term is repurposed for Unitarian Universalism to be more in alignment with the first Merriam-Webster definition. In our context, covenant is not a legally binding document, not between one another or between us and our idea of the sacred. We do not require a blood sacrifice, thank goodness, or a flood of epic proportions. Unlike Harry Potter, don't even require a wand for it, though let's be honest, that would be pretty amazing. For Unitarian Universalists, for a religious tradition centered around consent, agreeing to a covenant, just as agreeing to become a part of our membership, must be done of your own free will. In fact, the two are linked, as you just heard. Becoming a member means agreeing to our covenant. And this is necessary because, as our reading today shared, we are not a creedal faith. The question that has been asked of UUs since our merger in 1961 is, if you don't have a central creed, what do you believe? And while I understand why this is asked, it's not the right question. The primary question we focus our attention on is, what are our values, and how do we uphold them lovingly in an intentionally diverse community? If you are Buddhist and I am pagan and George is a Christian, how do we speak about what is most important to us while remaining in right relationship with one another? Our covenant gives us the framework of how to care for one another and outlines our willingness to be in relationship, even when, and I would add, especially when, it is a challenge to do so. We rarely need a reminder of how to treat one another when everyone is having a great time and we're all behaving. It's when there's anger, when there's hurt, when there's been a transgression, when we are most tender, that is when our covenant truly comes into play. And this question of how diverse people can create a loving community ultimately extends far beyond the merger in 1961. The very basis of our church governance is covenantal. And here I'm going to quote from a resource on the UUA's website. When the early Puritans came to America looking to form a new type of church, they chose to gather their churches using the ancient form of covenant. These first churches in America were created by mutual consent for mutual benefit in a time and place where survival depended on mutual cooperation. But they were not formed solely from need. They were also a reaction to a form of church organization that not only required everyone to subscribe to a certain set of beliefs, and also put all power and control into the hands of a church hierarchy. It is important to remember that our freedom of belief is closely tied to our freedom of self-governance or congregational polity, end quote. So this idea of mutual cooperation, a covenant, is essential to the freedom we find in our faith as UUs. You cannot have one without the other. As you may have guessed, we have a covenant here at Fun. Actually, we have many covenants at Fun. A covenant for the Board of Trustees, covenant for the staff, covenants for each of the groups affiliated with the church. And in a moment, you'll hear the new covenant between the church and myself as your minister. But our congregation's central covenant was adopted at the annual meeting in June 2023. And I'm going to read it to you. As a compassionate and nurturing community, we affirm our interdependence by celebrating our differences and the gifts each of us bring. It's just what I was talking about. Create a brave and courageous space that welcomes our whole selves while providing fertile ground for challenging discussions. Treat each other respectfully regardless of our differences, calling each other back into covenant with love when needed. Support the work of our congregation with both time and money to the extent allowed by our circumstances. And share the responsibility of creating a nurturing environment that widens our circle of inclusion for all. When this congregation decided to affiliate with the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, we agreed to the covenant of that association. This means that we are responsible for supporting the UUA and our sister congregations in any way that we can. Not only that, we're responsible for identifying the ways in which they're out of covenant with themselves, their fellow churches in the association, and the association itself. Did you know that part? That's a part of it. And when the difficult and awkward task of making a transgression known is over, we then are responsible for inviting that church back into covenant. It's not just a calling out, as I said, it is a calling in. An example of when this interchurch covenant comes into play would be if a congregation unexpectedly lost their minister. The colleagues in the area who are able to might agree to take turns preaching there on their Sundays off, or providing pastoral care until a plan is in place. It might mean that, I don't know, maybe when the AC breaks in the middle of a summer, like it did here last summer, that another UU congregation opens their space to us to worship in. Or that we work to help mentor a new congregation beginning the steps to associate with the UUA. These are the times in which our covenant to one another become living documents. And this is what holds us together with no creed. The desire to do right by one another, by our church and by our faith. It reminds us to have compassion in our relationships, to take responsibility and accountability for ourselves, to respect the autonomy and boundaries of others, to show pride in our actions and our representation of who we are, and to continuously grow into a better version of ourselves. It is how we manifest our values through relationships. It's quite lovely, this covenant that we have as a congregation, and lofty. Practical, but lofty. It's challenging to live into this covenant all the time. And that's okay, because that line, calling each other back into covenant with love when needed, tells us that with accountability, we are worthy of forgiveness and worthy of the effort it takes to call our mistake or our ongoing learnings to our attention. Covenant will not fix every issue that we have as a church, but it should lead us in how to treat one another when those issues arise, and no one is outside of it. When this church creates a covenant, it's expected we will all follow it, from the newest member to the choir to the safety team to the minister. We are all committed to the same covenant, and that means we all share the same ground. Should you or I step outside of our covenant, it's expected that, like our sistership with other congregations, another member is responsible for letting us know while also extending a hand to invite us back into covenant. The author of the novel The Alchemist wrote, "We are travelers on a cosmic journey, stardust, swirling and dancing in the eddies and whirlpools of infinity. Life is eternal. We have stopped for a moment to encounter each other, to meet, to love, to share. This is a precious moment. It is a little parenthesis in eternity." During our travels through the cosmos as stardust, we have the unbelievable luck of meeting, of loving, and sharing our lives with others. During your brief moment here on earth, there is so much to see and do and so much to commit yourselves to. For what and for whom will you write sacred promises on your heart? When we disappoint ourselves or others, let us lean into the covenant and accept the hand that invites us back. And in turn, when others disappoint us and break covenant, may we be the ones to remind them that love awaits them on the other side of repair. I believe that if we do this, we are choosing to make the most of this little parentheses in eternity. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.